Welcome to The Cannabis Professor, a marijuana science and culture podcast, broadcasting from the state of Pennsylvania to the rest of the nation and the world. Well, my name's Scott. I'm your professor, and thanks for joining me today, everybody. Now, in this episode, we're going to talk about a rather touchy subject. I'm sure something that we're all strangely informed about in some way, shape, or another, and that is law enforcement versus legalization. More specifically, should cops be allowed to get high? What would a drug policy for the weed police look like? And now to analyze this subject, because there's a lot of nooks and crannies, I am joined by my second in command, the other member in this growing team of two. So we run a lot of this media that we're doing, a cannabis professional of multi-state origin, Keegan. Thanks for joining me again today, man. Thanks for being here.
Yeah. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, man. Happy to be here.
Now, Keegan, before I make up a shitty nickname for you, because I love just throwing them off the cuff, do you have any nicknames that you've collected in life so far? I mean, Keegan's not the most common name, so maybe not.
Yeah, well, I played sports all growing up, so like in any sports culture, nicknames reign supreme. First of all, is obviously any last name. Like first names are right out the window. McHenry is my last name, so right away, McHenry, Mac, anything of that nature.
So you were a Mac.
Oh yeah, I was a Mac for a while.
I didn't even think of that.
That's
the shit.
All past girlfriends have been Keegs, so that one gets thrown around quite a bit. But the only one that I still get called is actually from college. And college was right around the time that Sons of Anarchy got really popular, the TV show. And in college, I had hair down to my shoulders and even a bigger beard than I have now, like very unkempt. So my teammates said that I looked like the character from the show Opie Winston. So all my friends from college to this day still either call me Opie or Winston or Winnie for short.
Wow, that is from Keegs to Winnie. You would have no freaking clue if you're talking about a human or a horse at that point. That's pretty good. Good stuff. Well, I'm glad you gave me quite a few different types of ammunition to choose from, all relatively inspiring ones too, which I like.
What about you?
Direct.
What about you? What's your go-to nickname?
So, although a lot of people call me Scotty, and I don't mind at this point because I'm old and mature, as a kid, of course, that always made it sound even more childish as a name. So a lot of people who went Scotty, I was just like, no, Scott's fine. Not a really hype about my name either. It sounds like a frat boy's name versus this dude. But I liked people call me Scottard for a while, just mixing first and last name. Just Goddard, because thankfully that's not too common of a last name at this point. They called my mom Mrs. God, which I thought was pretty respectable. I tried. Because I did play guitar for a while. Some of you, if you dig up my old band, Man the Fire, might see some good embarrassing videos and photos of me. But I tried doing like the, Sting did it, Cher did it, right? Slash did it. And I was like, maybe I'll just go by, God with 2 Ds, just so the church doesn't come at my throat. But I don't think I was ever good enough at anything in music to really pull off like a G-O-double-D kind of thing. So S-God for a little bit. But one restaurant called me Scotch. I was actually pretty into that. That's a cooler name than Scott. So Scotch if it was up to me. And then I guess the professor now I'm going to try to brand as, so that'll be fun. Yeah. The prof.
I like that. Prof, sir.
Well, so Keegan, I know this is something that we probably all can have a hot take on, because cops and weed, very interesting, always intimately tied together, never truly the way we wanted them to be tied together.
Oh, yeah.
But I wanted to break down for a second exactly what some of my thinking was in this, and then ask you maybe what your background it might be too. So Jersey recently went rec, right? And I'm working in Jersey last couple of weeks, helping out with the market. And I think it was like 2 days or 3 days right after the launch. So 4:20 something. And it's an early day. It's probably before 10 a.m. And helping with inventory, the dispensary operation stuff. And I look down, one moment to just throw some stickers on a couple eighth jars, right? You're always fighting barcodes in the weed world. And I look up and I'm surrounded by cops.
Lovely feeling.
Naturally, I think anybody surrounded by cops is going to feel a certain way when you didn't call them yourself. But even some folks who do call them feel a certain way about it. So seeing them suddenly, your heart jumps like a cricket on July asphalt. And it wasn't a setup, my friends out there. Don't worry too much. No laws were being broken. It's just kind of nuts working so closely with local law enforcement when you're in a rec market. I know you worked in rec market in Nevada, right?
Correct. As well as Washington for a brief period, but more on the grow side.
Ah, right on, right on. And so, for a lot of us cannabis advocates, folks who've worked on more than one side of the counter, it's a huge paradigm shift. It takes a little time to get used to, I think, for the cops and for us. A lot of people shopping were like, it's weird. I'm walking out with legal weed, but literally have to go buy like 4 squad cars. And although we're happy to have more access year to year, so we get to light them up more and more, it's funny enough that there's a class of people traditionally who have always thought about weed, but they can't actually experience a lot of this upgrade in quality of life and access to the plant. And that are the fuzz, right? 50, our law dog friends, simply the police. And so we want to take a look at this topic. Should they be allowed to have access or get high? Because right as it went legal, we all thought of ourselves and thought of this amazing thing. Now we can go and find some legal cannabis that's pretty close by. But they're adults, right? They probably had histories with it. It's kind of interesting to consider it from their side, briefly, to see what they think. So do you have any background with any law enforcement, Keegan? Either know anybody who does? Anything that would bias you in thinking that this is a good thing or a bad thing specifically? Maybe you're a gun nut I don't know about.
The only thing that I would say would influence me is actually at the dispensary that I currently manage, I have a former police officer on my staff.
Oh, really?
Yep, he worked Pennsylvania local police, not in Philly, in the burbs, for 20 years, and now is a bud tender inventory person, and he swears by it. Every time I talk to him, it is very, everyone on the force should be using this. There's always that stigma of police officers, more relying on alcohol to kind of, drink away their woes. But just from talking to him, he has, regaled me with many a tale about, man, if I could have smoked weed during this time instead of had to turn to alcohol, I think things could have gone a little bit differently for me in like my law enforcement career. So I would say just from talking to him, I didn't really grow up with many police officers. I'm from a very, very small town where we knew our police officers on a first name basis. So you were rarely getting arrested anyways. So there wasn't that much of a bad stigma in where I'm from. But just from talking to someone who's lived that life and hearing how they feel about it has really shifted my eyes to it. And actually, mentioning rec and medical, I have had more contact and interactions with the police in a medical market than I ever did in a rec market, which I think is very interesting, where police officers have actually come to my dispensary and reached out about education. Hey, do you guys offer anything that you can teach to the forces? And I've never been approached by that until maybe 3 or 4 months ago. We had a situation where a police officer had to come to the dispensary. I wound up talking to him. Everything was fine. Again, no laws were being broken. But afterwards, he was a younger cop, and he was asking, what should I look for in a stop? What makes weed compliant? They go, we only get like maybe a one-sheeter, maybe a PowerPoint presentation at the beginning of the year, but we don't have the materials and the education to smartly talk about weed in this, especially in Pennsylvania, where it's medical, it's legal, it's decriminalized in Philadelphia. It seems to me that they're having trouble, kind of living in this gray area that you and I in the cannabis industry have been living in for the past several years.
Oh, that's well said. And it's something that when I first got in, I think somebody mentioned, when the store opened, you had to let the cops in. And I was like, that does make a lot of sense, right? You're getting robbed. You don't want them to be, which door is the vault again? Like, which one's the bathroom? And not familiar enough. Every bank cop should know a little bit better, probably because that's more of a target. And correct. In PA, I think there's only been one situation. I think it was Allentown or something up there that somebody was robbed. It was like at gunpoint.
One in Bethlehem as well, yeah.
Okay, maybe it was Bethlehem. I just remember it was north of here per se. But the only one I heard of was like closed. Manager got, I think, at gunpoint. And thankfully, no violence had been committed, although certainly threatening and I'm sure scarring to that individual. But was at least good to see on that side of it. So for me, at least, I have lived next to cops a lot in my life. I grew up in the north part of the city. But funny enough, I was at 1825. I think 1819 was like a Philly cop. Never affected the way anybody acted on that street, I guarantee you. It was as trashed and as graffitied, and I think they broke into my dad's van as many times as you could, regardless of being feet from a cop. So at least in that relationship, it was a lot more familial, right? Like he was just a neighbor.
Right.
Thankfully, nobody felt like it was something shady or we all had to act like Boy Scouts for it. But my dad was a Marine, so I feel like in that military way, there was still like the law and order feature under it. Once I moved out of the city to the burbs, we then literally lived in a twin directly next to a Horsham officer. He, funny enough, passed away recently, unfortunately. RIP for the man named Steve. But he was an alkie. And so kind of much to what you said, absolutely showing the classic officer stress, alcohol kind of combination that I think a lot of them go to. And I, of course, have had some run-ins with the law just with cannabis. If you've listened to the show, you've heard about when I got majorly busted with squad cars and a canine, and then random traffic stops. I think we've all dealt with at some point in other varying levels of success. But the funny thing is when they were in the vault recently, when I was surrounded, if you will, much like what you said with the bud tender who's an ex-cop, they were just asking like the best human questions, like, oh, wow, that's more than I thought. What does that one do? What's the difference in these two? Like, why is there so many random names and ridiculous labels that you have to deal with? And it kind of felt like, of course, in my nature, I was just like, I just want to help. I want everybody to understand this shit better so we can deal with it, and jumped in a little bit. And hopefully, if life is very fair and maybe even a little bit better, maybe I'll be able to get that somebody on the show like that. Extend the invitation to the gent that works for you as well. I'd love to hear directly from the mouth of the law or the ex-law. I think that'd be pretty freaking awesome. And I think we're going to talk about the law quite a bit in the upcoming minutes, however long it takes. We're not here to try to soften the view of it. We know that police individually have done some shit. I'm not trying to clean any of that up. We're not here to humanize officers of the law. They are already human, thankfully. But it's the job, which is kind of inhuman. I think we all can relate to inhuman moments in our own like career fields. Sometimes it makes you amplify inhuman behaviors when your job requires it. And funny enough, in sports, this happens a lot, right? People who play violent sports often beat up their girlfriends for some reason. And I feel like, if it made your money during the day, you're probably going to possibly use it at night and see if it still works. I think also about like CEOs in Shark Tank, right? They just can't give up trying to make deals all day long.
Right.
So the first thing I wanted to visit is, what is the current policy on police using cannabis? We can see exactly how they're being treated now, because you'd think legal means legal, and it's a big old asterisk with that. We'll look at some federal drug policies as well to see how we're treating the more well-employed federal law officers and folks in those departments. And then kind of take a look at a couple scenarios, just how do we prefer police go drunk versus high, because ideally there's probably one vice or the other they'll choose. So funny enough, since you worked in a couple different states, did you have police at your dispensaries in the states that you worked at?
So in Nevada, it was required to have armed security, like visibly armed. But also in Las Vegas in that first year, there were a lot of attempted robberies of dispensaries. So there were more police presence in general. It was not uncommon to see a squad car in a dispensary parking lot. But if anything, that actually had the intended effect of police, which was safety, which you wouldn't think outside of, I'm buying my weed, I feel even safer with a cop here next to me. But just because it was kind of a problem for that first 12 to 18 months, I think there were 6 attempted robberies in the first year of recreational in Las Vegas. Some of them turned to deadly shootouts. So there definitely was a bigger police presence, and we had to meet with them at a store level about once a year was really all I saw them. They kind of did similar to what a security company would do now, of just, where are the exits? Do you have an active shooter plan? This is what we would do. This is your average response time, more of like preparation. Luckily, where I was working was off the strip, not a particularly dangerous area. So nothing ever crazy happened in my neck of the woods. But there was definitely that the presence was more felt, where you would see them more often kind of patrolling your parking lot, the surrounding blocks, those kind of things, as opposed to now in the medical market where you might see them, but unless they're called, you don't really see them in the area.
Yeah, right now I think it's squad cars in the parking lot, and a lot when it starts. And then, of course, less and less. I feel like it'll become just maybe a weekend thing from here and there when they're on that kind of detail too. And so you said you were a native of the state of Washington, if I'm correct.
Oh, yeah.
So starting off, what is the current policy in policing using cannabis? And funny enough, since Washington was one of the earliest states into it, you would think, okay, well, I guess maybe somebody's dealt with this problem a while. Technically, nobody's dealt with this problem
Yeah.
yet.
Yeah, to my knowledge, it's still no, that they have to obey federal law, which is kind of where they get, where police officers, and actually the other group that's affected by the same token is truckers, is they have
Oh,
to obey federal laws and be federally compliant. And since cannabis is obviously still federally Schedule One, that counts against them. Now, obviously, we see like New Jersey, as I'm sure we'll get to, which is trying to break some barriers. But Washington, and actually, I have some friends that do long haul trucking as well that can't get their medical cards if they're medical in their home state, or don't shop in their rec markets, when they're traveling to those states for that same reason of federal law kind of trumps whatever state they're in for their particular profession.
man, it's so interesting because it sneaks in these like kind of, I mean, some of the areas are clear as hell, right? Like federal law preventing banking is kind of something that's probably a little bit more well known, not by everybody, but by some. Insurance, I think this is why we get screwed with insurance, because insurance is more multi-state. So although they will cover it if you have like an FSA or HSA, you can't really deduct it from taxes as a result because of the federal side of it too. So there are these sneaky little areas, and that is funny. Truckers, I wouldn't have really thought as specifically. I did find a couple of random ones as I was digging around some research for
Oh
it.
yeah,
But you're dead nuts on. The current policy, as it has been since almost a decade ago now, um,
crazy.
in every flippin' state, is police are not allowed to touch it because federal law. Now, a couple places have said, well, maybe for medical considerations, and I'll see if I could figure out which ones. But a lot of it was guns equal federal, federal equals schedule. That means you can't mix the two. And it's kind of weird because in PA, our laws are very classic.
Yeah.
And my dad passed years and years ago. And he had, I think, 4 guns, which I eventually sold in because I was a poor guy. You need some money more than I need the
Oh yeah.
guns. And there was no paperwork. I just owned the gun. So technically, as even a med patient, your pa dies, you get all his firearms, and it's no real big deal, it seems, in the way that goes. So kind of interesting in the way that you see some of the laws state by state. We then also have, let's see, in Illinois, because they went legal in 2020, the Chicago Police Department said you can't get into it, but they're not going to ask about the history on your application. So ideally, it should no longer affect one's ability to get the job if you used it before.
Correct.
And they said this was going to help widen the recruitment pool because there are some good people out there who, of course, have used cannabis before, and now they're getting screwed pretty badly. Now, that then brings up one other interesting one, which is the federal policies, because since we said state by state, it's a little weird. Well, Jersey's one that actually is trying to get around this. And they said it's okay. I think their attorney general was the one who actually said that they are allowed to smoke weed. I then asked directly to officers who were in the vault. So you guys can like totally smoke some weed now, right? Like you need a recommendation. They're like, no, we know he said, right? In his piece of paper. That's cool. But they still work for a dude who's going to fire the hell out of you if you show up high at work or piss green in it. So it became one of those things where, much like a lot of states, it's legal in one way, but it is not legal practically in any way.
Right. That seems to be the big barrier is, yeah, you can do it. And even actually in talking to my cop employee or ex-cop, he was saying the same kind of things where the introductory screening has changed in the last little bit, even in Pennsylvania, where, it's like they hook you up to a lie detector. They ask you, have you ever smoked weed before? And now they consider that an irrelevant question, just kind of how you said, like it doesn't actually dictate if someone is qualified for the job or not anymore. So it's nice that even in PA, kind of how you said that it's not held against you anymore. But I actually just before I got on this call was reading about New Jersey, and there's already 5 motions to counteract the attorney general's yes, cops can consume marijuana when they're not off duty. Yeah, there's already pushback, and that happened 2-3 weeks ago. That came out, and they're already trying to fix that because obviously then you get the avalanche effect. As soon as one state to allow it, well, then you would expect the Washingtons, the Colorados, the Oregons to all kind of follow. And so I think that setting that precedent, while for us is very, very good, I think that would help the culture, help kill a lot of stigma. but I think they view it as like an avalanche effect of once you allow one state, well, then every state where it's legal in some capacity is going to want to follow suit. And I just think they are having a hard time wanting to keep up with that and those changes and that turnover.
Yeah, funny enough, as I looked around too, a couple of ex-officers kind of answering this question on the internet side of it were saying the same. It's so hard to test for cannabis that a lot of them just don't like the hurdles. It isn't that they really think officers can't get high in their like heart of hearts, but who wants to deal with all this paperwork? Who wants to deal with discipline? Who wants to create these kind of middle steps? And nobody wants to be first, but they will most likely, like you said, mimic through. So at least for the FBI, because I had heard about this a couple of years ago, that they relaxed their policy quite a bit. They said, the famous director James Comey in 2014, before all the nonsense, suggested that he wanted to loosen the policies because potential skilled workers were being passed over due to the requirement. He said, and I quote, "I have to hire a great workforce to compete with those cyber criminals. And some of those kids want to smoke weed on the way to the interview." Which you're damn right they do, Comey. You are tapped in. I guess you guys actually do find some truth while you're at work those days. And so he goes on just to mention that for anything other than marijuana, there's still a 10-year ban before you're eligible for employment. So simply, if you're very honest and you like to get coked up on the weekends, you got to wait a good decade before, although I don't think there's any way to prove it's been more than a couple days. Sure, those bastards get away. But for marijuana, they said, we just don't ask.
Right.
In the police force in Illinois, they said it went from, and in Seattle as well, instead of saying 3 years, no use, I think it was as long as you didn't use it in the past 12 months, then you could apply. And they said if you're 18 going right into like the academy, then technically it doesn't matter if you were smoking it the day before you're 18. They just said whatever because you're young. It's kind of nice, I think. At least it shows, again, nobody wants to deal with it, but they're kind of don't ask, don't telling it.
Yeah.
Couple of differences around the government. So in the DOD, the Department of Defense, they said that you can't even use CBD. Really?
A federally legalized substance?
Made clear that CBD is off limits for its service members. I think because they know you can have 0.3% THC. And so it starts to muddy that same water that nobody wants to look at. The Air Force said that you are prohibited. The Navy said no CBD regardless of its legal status specifically.
Wow.
And the Coast Guard said, at least in 2019, that, sailors going port to port can't use marijuana or visit state legal dispensaries.
Wow.
So yeah, they kind of cucked those motherfuckers really hard and absolutely blocked them from. I mean, I thought the hemp bill would take care of some of that at least.
I thought some of that. I mean, and it's interesting just from, again, being from a small town, all of my friends joined the military right out of high school. And they would come back and they would just do different things that were harder to test for, which is
like a challenge.
It was a challenge. And it's crazy. All of the military guys that I know, when they would get their leaves, their breaks, whatever, it was mushrooms was the number one thing, because the only way to get it is through a spinal tap. And they're not spinal tapping every recruit that just came back from their first leave. You know, those tests are a couple $100 a pop. So you're testing 5,000-10,000 people. It adds up pretty quick. So I think it's interesting that they're still maintaining this, when I feel like if I am a military general, I am way more concerned if somebody is tripping balls on my battlefield than anything else.
Yeah, right. And just because it's hard to test for, it's such a weird soft gate, all really in measurement. So furthermore, beyond the more direct military side of the government, NASA, right, the Nerd Club, said that CBD products could contain unauthorized THC concentrations that could jeopardize jobs if employees fail a drug test. So, yeah, I guess they're all playing that to the fence a little bit. But the DOT, I guess they're ahead of the curve. They drive forwards. They took a different approach last year, stating that they would not be testing drivers for CBD. So,
nice.
You can get rid of that foot pain finally.
Yeah.
Now, lastly, as far as all the agencies or the list of agencies that I found, the DEA, classic. They continue to enforce their policy of automatically disqualifying applicants who have used marijuana. They still maintain the 3 years no smoke, which does make sense to me. I feel like that's probably the one that's a little less mature. I just go, well, yeah, you're the DEA. Like, you're not allowed to get fucking high. You make us to deal with so much shit all the time.
And what, hair tests go back, what, like 7 years or something like that? Something
Yeah,
crazy?
way too long. So I guess they're saying no more hair
Yeah.
follicle tests for a lot of these places.
Yeah. I was thinking like, well, you could just lie. But I mean, if you're the DEA, they could probably have some pretty intricate testing. But I can't imagine everybody's doing hair tests.
Yeah, expensive is always what I heard from them. Knowing that normal drug
Yeah.
screening, it just adds time to employment. But it's funny because a lot of the logic that they're saying really is, I feel like a lot of logic that we're dealing with in post-COVID now, which is kind of the need for good employees versus this stodgy kind of rule that without a doubt stuffed shirts keep together. All these organizations, I'm sure we could imagine, are housed by the crustiest, oldest son of a bitches that have ever been on the planet Earth. They've certainly survived enough wars and famine and shit like that. And I feel like they stay hard line to that. Much like with a lot of cops, I'm sure you just have to literally wait till some of the old ideas physically die.
Oh, yeah.
Before you actually have some progress and change in it specifically too. And so that brings us to some of our last thinking. So if they were able to, since we can see that clearly they're not, how do you think that policy would go? Just let them go at it and no questions, no answers?
I feel like it would have to be, especially because I think the point that you made early on about, firearms equal federal, I think that's an important thing, especially with everything that's happening in the geopolitical landscape around police and authority in general. I feel like off duty, yeah, 100%. I don't feel like that needs much monitoring. If you want to ensure that, people aren't policing while high, although I bet you that would cut down on the number of speeding tickets, violent offenses. I mean, someone might forget to turn their body cam on, but
happens already.
Yeah. Just saliva tests, I think, would have to be like my initial jumping off point, because I know in Washington, I don't know if we're quite there in PA right now, but in Washington, if you get pulled over, and I have heard from a few people that have friends in law enforcement, that there is things that you can, like, markers of.
Hello, this is the professor from the editing desk. Unfortunately, we had Zoom crap out on us and say we could not record any further, so we had to pivot to a different recording software. I think we use Skype for the rest of the call. So you'll notice in one or two portions of it a little bit of a jump, but I'll drop you right back into the call as we were able to get it reconnected. All right, you good? You hear me? All good?
All good.
Crazy. Well, pivoting.
Love that.
As we get back into the call, we have had to switch to our third choice video service, from Zoom to Google to Skype. And we got Teams left, so we still got one to bail us out in case this one shuts down. Apparently, I've not paid enough to Zoom because I like to use it for free. But regardless, we'll jump back into our topic because I believe we were just talking about policy with officers of the law and exactly how it might work, and talking about the difficulty it is really with testing if they're high, it seems, especially.
Right. Kind of trying to pick up where I was at was I have some friends whose parents or relatives are in law enforcement. So now when they're driving, there are specific things that police can use to pull you over for being under suspicion of driving under the influence, other than just being drunk, which, is the swerving, kind of haphazard driving, those kind of things. Now they can actually pull you over for suspicion of driving under the influence for the classic weed symptoms: driving too slow, leaving your blinker on, those kind of things. And to my knowledge is that right there on the spot, they can do a saliva test, put it in a mixture. If it turns blue, similar to a lot of other substances, will show if there's enough THC still in your system currently to say that you were driving under the influence, which is, obviously if you get in an accident, they can do a blood test, but in the moment, saliva seems to have a decent reliability rate. So I think that if they were to implement it, if you were allowing law enforcement to consume marijuana, I feel like you would have to have some sort of policy in there that, hey, as long as you admit it, sign this sheet that says you will take a saliva test before you come into work every day. Cool. We know that you smoke weed. It doesn't get put anywhere. It just says that you'll take a saliva test. Then I feel like that's a more responsible, trackable way of hey, you can still go smoke weed after your shift. Hey, you just saw some crazy shit on the south side of Philly, which will scar anyone. We would rather you use this than, drown your sorrows away in a bottle of whiskey. The same way that, if someone comes into work drunk, you can breathalyze them, you can blood test them. There's a lot of those different things. I feel like if you treat it like alcohol, then you can make that equivocation with it. Obviously I would rather have a high police officer than a drunk police officer. That's the last thing I think anybody needs, is somebody who's already on edge being drunk and making snap decisions.
Yeah, I feel like drunk is usually a little bit of a shorter thought process. If anything, being high, you're likely like, oh, they got away. I mean, paranoia and fear, certainly still things to consider, and we know they can be exacerbated with cannabis use, usually in earlier stages rather than later. It's not usually that people are like 5 years into smoking and they start having those issues, but we know it's possible, and it does happen to some unfortunate people out there. I think in the same, would I rather deal with one that gets high all the time or drunk all the time? High, without a doubt. I mean, even in my relationships, would I rather deal with a friend who drinks to excess or gets high to excess? High, without a doubt. That person is probably going to be a lot healthier. And not only for their health, but for our health, right? For the health of those who actually have to deal with them. There always seems to be one thing not considered, I guess. And you've touched on it as well, which is, we do need to be able to test them in the moment so that you can make sure they can't try to sneak it. But on the other side of things, like they can drink and go to work and potentially breath mint and just be below the level where it affects their job. And there's nothing stopping that from happening. So although we are creating another avenue that people could potentially abuse something, we're just replicating an avenue which is already legal and worse by every measure.
Right.
It's already, you're not allowed to drink and drive. You're not allowed to drink and do pretty much anything in this planet, but high is a lot less inebriated than it. So I feel like instead of creating the comparison, they're just talking about weed on its own. But the comparison kind of shows like it'd be very hard to maintain the feeling against alcohol that weed is going to create so much worse. We know that for their own health, it's better. They seem to think that way, a lot of them too. The ones I've talked to, the ones that you employ. And so to run through like a quick little thought process, what do you think you would do differently if you noticed that the cop who pulled you over was high?
I think I'd be more honest.
Okay.
I think I would be more honest. And I'm pretty straightforward with the cops now, obviously. I'm sure that you and I have different relationships with law enforcement. But I was arrested for cannabis when I went to college in Utah, of all places. So
sounds like a straight state.
Yeah, got the book thrown at me. And, I had weed in my car and all that stuff. And I certainly didn't tell him I had weed. But he saw it like on me, like I had grinded weed on my pants. Like I had just finished smoking a joint. Like, and that was when smell was probable cause, which now, to my understanding, in most states, it is no longer probable cause to search the car. You still have to ask for permission, even if you smell it. And then in 2014, that would have been, if you smelled it, boom, I can search your car under probable cause. Now, if I had known that this cop was high, if he had the red eyes or something, or I just knew it was a accepted thing, I feel like I would have felt a little bit more safe to say, hey, I have weed on me. This is where it's at. You still follow all the things, but I remember being pulled over and, knowing how much weed I had on me, as long with my pipe and my grinder. In Utah, that's 2 different charges. You get paraphernalia as well as substance.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Double slap.
But I also feel like then it would help me connect with an officer more. Because right now I feel like there is an obvious separation between being a civilian and being an officer of the law. There is a strong divide, and it carries over into, other civilian debates. There's, police lives, there's pro and anti law enforcement things everywhere. We saw it in Washington, at my home state. They just defunded the police by several $1 million. And, that's a whole separate topic, but, at least I think it would shrink that gap a little bit. Because if you look at how many millions of people smoke weed just in Pennsylvania, you are narrowing that gap between the general public and those that are put in charge of keeping order for that public. So I think that having someone that shared the same struggles as me, or at least admitted to having those same struggles, whether it be mental or physical, I think would help create that bond between civilian life and law enforcement life.
Yeah, it almost sounds impractical because it's like, sure, yeah, if you knew a cop was like a little drunk or a little high, you'd be more honest. But I honestly, right, good filler. I feel like this maintains more than it even seems like it would in logic. Because at times, if anyone out there's ever been near like an off-duty officer and been drinking, you realize they're not there telling everybody to like breathalyze before they leave. They're like, no, it's cool, man. Like as long as you know you can handle it. And you see this other side where there's discernment, a little bit of that humanity sneaks back in. And so for me, on a different but relatable topic, right, still moving violations and getting stopped by officers of the law, I like to own cars that are loud and sometimes fast when they work. And and then they take a lot of attention. One old car I have is very yellow and very, very like, rice burny, I guess, if you will. Love the sort of Fast and the Furious life, although I hate that movie franchise. Come at me. And I remember being pulled over consistently just due to the car. Now, sometimes there was weed on me, but the car was enough to get you pulled over at that stage in life. But at one point, fast forward a couple of years later, it's daytime. And I get pulled over one of the rare times, but my tint was always technically illegal, right? They kind of choose when to pull you over based on that. And a guy pulls me over because my taillight's out. First time, legitimately, I didn't do anything totally wrong. Right. And I knew from that point, roll down all your windows because I'm just trying to establish trust, right? I don't need anybody to have a hand on a weapon if this isn't that kind of stop. And I told him, like, you can reach in and grab it. It's in the back of my, like, chair in the map pocket kind of thing. And then as soon as he realized, like, I wasn't trying to hide anything because I rolled everything down so he could have full view and no smoke came billowing out, at least that day. He immediately said, so, how quick is this thing? and it was one of those moments where like, are you trying to fuck with me right now? Because if I say like real fast, are you just going to be like, yeah, that's what I thought. But his body language was encouraging. He seemed like he wanted it to be a calm day too. And I kind of just went for him. I was like, oh, it can get up there. Thankfully the Germans know what they're doing. And then he immediately is like, oh, well, I got like a Mustang 5.0 at home, and he's talking Fox body this, and I'm talking, Audi that. And we were able to still go through the motions of a traffic stop without it at all feeling nearly as weird on both ends. I was calm, he was calm, he got it done, and, I eventually paid that ticket. But because he was willing to be, like, admit that he was human, I could then be a human too.
Right.
It doesn't seem realistic, but I honestly, if some guy was like, oh yeah, no, I know you were just coming from the bar, man, you're not drunk, right? I would be like, yeah, no, I'm not drunk, I don't drive drunk, even though if I had a beer, just to know that I could actually talk to them. And I think this might have been akin to the kind of relationships you could achieve when you actually know the officers' first names like you did growing up.
Yeah, absolutely. You had Officer Mark Smith. There were a number of people that if you were coming home from a party, and he would often know where these parties were, he would just follow you home is all he would do.
No lights or anything?
No lights. If you got pulled over, I can think of one story in particular where the girl I was dating at the time got pulled over by Officer Smith. Says, hey, did you just come from the party on this street? Said, yeah, I live like half a mile down the road. He goes, cool. I'm just going to follow behind you to make sure you get home safe since you've been drinking. And it's like, there was no ticket. There was nothing else. It was just literally, I'm just going to make sure you get home safe, and I'm here in case anything happens.
Serve and protect, right? It sounds exactly like those words combined, dude.
And but that's obviously one in a million scenarios. He is the one officer in the one small town that was like, I went to the same high school that you guys went to. I'm only, 10, 15 years older than you guys. I still remember having these same things. I'll just make sure you get home. It's not a big deal. That's less than 0.5% of law officers in this country.
It's much like what you'd mentioned when they reached out, to the medical marijuana side of things, just to ask for some instruction. It's been something I've been tempted to want to do, but it's very difficult because, again, there's still like guns, there's still badges, there's still like a hell of a lot of room between us and law enforcement. It feels that way. Certainly certain news organizations and certain folks really like maintaining that, like, fuck you, we have like extra rights and you don't. But in this area, we actually have extra rights over them, and I kind of feel less like, haha, in your face, because that just is people whose lives are tougher to live than mine most days of the week. and seeing them able to help us out at the dispensary level. Again, it's individual. I can't say the police like it's one person, but I went to the internet to try to find a couple more sort of rhymes and rules from folks who were officers, and on Quora, I think is how you pronounce that, the easiest matchup on question on Google. As I was finding which state did what in this, I did find one or two answers that were pretty good that we can visit. So one of them said, as states begin to legalize both med and rec cannabis products, it does become difficult for peace officers. As law enforcement, they're obliged to uphold all city, state, and federal laws. As you said, Fed is a big part of their job still, even if they're not federal law officers specifically. Cannabis products are still Schedule I drugs, and possession or consumption is still illegal federally. Most law enforcement, there is a clause that they do where they say they are police every second of the day. And this does explain to folks who do not know about that clause why some cops can seem like dicks all day long. Folks who it goes to their head. I'm sure priests are the same, right? Priests are priests when they go to bed and when they wake up. At least they fucking should be. And I think it's that idea where, like, if you can't escape it and it's just a job, your behavior starts to really get pushed around. It's almost like solitary confinement in a very opposite but still strangely limiting fashion. And there are no exemptions to that rule. The gentleman who wrote this said his gun nut friend likes to point out that in their home state, they're supposed to be armed 24/7. It's part of so you can always do your job as an officer of the law. So they say getting high with a gun is a bad idea, and that seems to be the core of this federal law. It's the gunplay. I don't think it'd be hard for a cop to deal with parking shit and some traffic stuff.
Yeah, a meter maid can get as high as they want.
Right? Yeah, just if anything, they just might actually get the license plate right from time to time. But this is really about gunplay. And as I said, as a guy who had guns, as a guy who does drive cars and at times I'm sure is overlapped with being high, I don't feel like it's as much of an issue as they state. Of course, they're talking about danger, so they don't want anybody to not make it home. But I would imagine that it's kind of like, well, yeah, if everybody's starting out, but once you smoke weed for a half year to a year, I don't believe these dangers exist as much. It's probably more the newbies than the old bees in that.
Correct. That don't know what they're doing, over medicating, getting to that point of anxiety and paranoia, which is just education. No one talks about alcohol education. Really, no one says, oh, you should drink this alcohol. Oh, you hear about moderation, but no one really sits down and says, have one, have two. They just say, oh, just, if you got money and you're 21, go for it.
Right.
Versus the world that we're in, where it's heavily education focused, and knowing what you're doing plays an important role in how you handle your medication.
Yeah. So one other answer, a gentleman named Tim Dees, retired cop and criminal justice professor from Reno. So back in the beauty of Nevada, and works in the municipal court and Pyramid Lake. I'm guessing that might be a casino. But he said he doesn't have access to operations manual for Colorado agencies, but his guess would be no, of course they can't consume. Marijuana may be lawfully purchased and used in Colorado, but it's still Schedule I. And he mentions more so detectable in the bloodstream for days or weeks after ingestion. If your car was struck by a police patrol car or you were shot by an officer, how do you think the case would go if you were able to show the driver or shooter had marijuana metabolites in his or her system? The officer who had partaken of the devil's weed, as he put it, so he gives a great little stab in the back, would be giving the aggrieved citizen a license to demand a check with a lot of zeros from the police agency. So it's kind of on the other side. He says, although we are pro-weed and I think cops should have access, what if you were at the bottom of that story? Would you be crucifying them because they had weed metabolites in their system?
Well, I think it's probably got to operate on the same way as driving a car. There's a legal limit of alcohol that you're allowed to have in your system and still responsibly operate a motor vehicle. If it's that same testing method that we talked about before, if it's, as long as you are under that threshold, I feel like it's a non-issue. As long as you make that the hard, fast rule is, however you measure it, nanograms, or however you want to quantify the amount of THC in your bloodstream, there should be a threshold. And if you are under that because it is in your bloodstream for, longer than just a day, then I feel like that should be okay. That's an excellent point. I had not thought about that. But
He brings it good because people like to use, I mean, and I wouldn't say that's marijuana users versus cops even. That's just a good old America and the right to sue the shit out of anything you don't like, whether or not it's going to go anywhere. It wastes just a lot of time and money. So the firearm thing is in focus in that, and of course measurement seems to be some of the bigger factors we've been able to extract from this. Now, just as a little roundup, because you did mention Utah. So in the West, states have had this longer. Just for the final word on it, in Cali, they are at the forefront of a lot of liberal cannabis laws, but still zero cop use to it. They did mention Utah, and this said a little different. And funny enough, because I think, no, I've never been to Utah. You lived in Utah for a little bit?
Yeah, lived in Utah for 2 years.
So I'll ask you this before I say the little like quote from the internet. My thought on Utah is heavily informed by all of the bullshit that gets exported by Utah. So from what I would be able to tell Utah is, and I know it's not this case, but this is what the internet would tell me or media. It is wall to wall, just thick as thieves Mormons. And Scientology's got a stab. So like if you, depending on where you're standing, nobody's trying to celebrate shit. Nobody's dancing or having any fun. A lot of early weddings. A lot of young people getting married like first, second year of college, as that is sort of fulfilling the prophecy or the covenant in their bonds.
Oh, yeah.
And outside of the movie SLC Punk, which is the only thing that showed me that Utah isn't just straight up like tucked in shirts and collars. The feeling is, it's Mitt Romney's state. It's just like, it's a bunch of just folks who are straight and hard line.
Yeah.
So what would you tell me? What is Utah really? Is it actually just like a normal place?
No, it is certainly not normal. So Salt Lake City, yeah, is it's a nice bubble of realism where, it's a big enough place where you can get into any trouble you possibly want. Anything that you want to get into in North Philly, you can find in Salt Lake.
So it's like a normal city.
Yeah.
Or a normal capital city even, right?
Yeah.
Some bullshit
Yeah.
with
Salt Lake City, very, very normal. It's got its pockets of it, but outside of it is where it gets funky. So I lived up north in Logan, Utah.
Okay.
Mormon home base. That is definitely where on my college campus, so I went to Utah State for 2 years. On college campus, there was housing living where if you got pregnant in your first 2 years of schooling, you could like raise your family on campus and still live on campus. There was special LDS housing, Latter-day Saint.
Yeah, Latter Days.
Which was considerably nicer than the freshman dorms I was in, because they got that good church money. Mm-hmm. Very uptight, not very open to a lot of different points of view. In my first month of going to school there, I was told that I was going to hell more times than I've ever been told in the rest of my life combined.
Was it like visceral? Was it like in your face, like God hates the F word kind of thing? Or was it like, no, sir, I really would like better things for you, but you're just actually going to go to hell if you don't follow me into this laundromat and take these white shirts?
Pretty split. Especially, I mean, now college is a unique forum for that because, while yes, most of the people that went to Utah State were from Utah and it was a predominantly Mormon LDS school, obviously colleges, people come from everywhere. We were an NCAA school, so, there were athletes from everywhere. I was on the hockey team. We had a football team, baseball team, all that stuff. So those guys aren't typically from Utah. So some of them were like, oh, that's cool. Not for me, but, do your thing. There was, a couple Mormon hockey players on our team. Their big joke was they would bring a 6-pack of grape soda to every party and then DD everybody home. Like very, very cool about it.
Yeah, that's a clever way to roll with it. I think you make some good friends that way.
Yeah. But of course there were lots of people preaching on college campus, big signs, God or hell, those type of things, very strict, no lines. And that's kind of impacted me when I got charged was I had all my weed in a grinder when I got pulled over. LeBron James threw all my weed in the car trying to hide it. So all they recovered was 2.3 grams of weed, a pipe, and a grinder. And I got a year probation, $6,000 in fines.
Oh, that's steep.
A year of drug counseling and 36 hours of community service. So they took it to the fullest extent that they possibly could without actually, jail time or anything like super, super serious.
Christ.
So it's
Almighty.
a weird dichotomy. To Utah's credit, the prettiest state I've ever been to, the best skiing, the best hiking, the best mountain biking, anything you want to do there, you can do it. But the people are different. It's culture shock in an entirely different way.
Wow. So it's interesting because their cannabis law was at least in front of the curve, if only by a couple of feet. They said that they allow police recruits who use medical marijuana to apply to be officers. So you can have a medical card there and go I guess, and have a gun on you at some point.
Now,
this was a change.
I think that's interesting because Utah actually is in the top 5 states in opioid addiction for that same reason, is that if you are LDS and you get prescribed a painkiller, well, that's not a drug. A doctor gave it to me. Those aren't drugs. These Vicodin or Oxy aren't drugs because a doctor gave it to me. But they actually have one of the worst heroin epidemics because they get hooked on painkillers, not thinking that they're dangerous or thinking that they're real drugs. And then that leads to horrible addiction. So it's actually weird that in this very, white collar, white picket fence type of, outlook that they try to give to the world, they have horrible opioid and heroin addiction. So I wonder if they're trying to combat some of that with, not that I think cannabis is even close to an evil, but in their eyes, fighting an evil with a lesser evil.
Yeah, like, better that than the other ones. And since they have a clear example of how badly the other side's going, it's like, yeah, you kind of have to pivot a little bit. That is interesting. I wonder, I would hope that there's at least some better adult rationalization in there. They said their prior law forbade academy applicants who've used cannabis in the past 2 years to apply at all for the program. So theirs was a 2-year ban, 2 years clean before you apply now. You can have up to a med card, which is pretty incredible. And they said if you do have a med card in there, for anybody out there who just got inspired for some reason to want to go and sign up for the force out in the TAW. Do they call it the TAW? Well, we'll see.
Yeah, we'll start it. It can start here.
Back in the TAW, they must show that their use is legitimate. And I wonder what the threshold of that is. I might have to dig into that for a future episode, as well as disclose all the products they use so that the TAW, Department of Agriculture and Food, okay, I see what you did there, can check if the product has been approved for use. So they have their own little Department of Agro that can let them know. So still in front of the curve. That's probably the best policy I've seen, since most of them just go, fuck no, you can't use weed.
Right.
Now, the reason why Jersey's so unique is because they said, fuck yes, you can. And then each spot is hot lighting, sure you can. I've seen police chiefs saying, screw you. Certainly the officers who I spoke with directly, I will not give their names because they're good people. And I don't want anybody to lose their job for no damn reason, especially not for weed. They said, our bosses said, fuck you. So they're like, we all know the one person who's going to try it in the department.
Oh, yeah.
They all were like, we already know that one who takes like bad pictures on Facebook and shit. They're like, but we're not going to be the guinea pigs.
I'm not that guy, yeah.
Yeah. In Arizona, police departments allow the use of medical marijuana for their first responders. And only a couple police departments, or they say a few, which means 3 in my mind, stand against medical marijuana use by cops. Arizona agencies don't have special policies. Well, I read that right wrong. When it comes to cops being prescribed medical marijuana cards, but some employees whose cannabis may risk getting reassigned or classic retaliation, getting put on paid leave, which I know sounds way better than it must be. When I was put on leave, it was never fucking paid. But still, my heart goes out with them. And that brings me to some of the last thoughts that we might have on it, because final thoughts are, why should cops be allowed to use, or why should they not be allowed to use marijuana? That we've gone through it. So what are some of the reasons that we talked about why they should be allowed to use it, right?
Right. So to my thought is kind of how we were just talking about the TAW, is everybody has a vice, and it is the trope that police officers go to alcohol, and it is overwhelmingly true, unfortunately. And I can say this with statistical data. I can say it from talking to my own employee that has had these very same interactions. And I think that it's more about their own mental health. And that if we create a better mentally healthy class of law officers, well, then they will be able to more healthily uphold the law. I think that if you are spiraling and you are in this alcoholic cycle of drinking, sobering, cranky, all these different things, well, then you are getting an inherently pissed off officer before anything ever happens. And so I think it's less about, oh, we should be legal and this and that. I think it's more using what we already have started to see with the limited testing that we've gotten to have for cannabis and mental health, and applying that to an area that needs it the most. And again, we're not here to humanize police or do anything like that, but it is inherently a difficult job. You are met with death. You are met with life endangering situations. You have to deliver very hard messages to families very often. Your son or daughter has passed. They were killed. This and that. That will take a toll on anybody. It would certainly take a toll on me. And if all I have to do is drink, well, then I'm going to be dependent on something that makes me chemically addicted to it. So I think if we look at it from less of it should be legal because cannabis isn't a bad thing, which I agree with, obviously. I think if we approach it as more of this will help you with the struggles that you are going through in your difficult job, I think would create a more healthy conversation as opposed to, well, I think it should be legal because I support cannabis. No, we think that you should use it because it will help you. And if you are in a better spot, well, then the community will be in a better spot. And then I think that could, get a couple lucky breaks that could create a snowball effect of kind of lessening this polarity of law enforcement that we have.
Yeah, I think, that's the larger factor without a doubt. And then on the back end too, which is kind of funny, it's legal. So that's a great reason they should be allowed to use it. They are enforcers of the law. If the law finally swings in their benefit, wouldn't it be cool if they could also benefit in some ways? I think, like, as you said, getting them closer in their behavior to the way we would expect people to act as opposed to just having to be the shield or the badge, would obviously help not only them not feel alienated, because I know that's one bigger thing. It's like you have to do things nobody else in society has to do, and that's going to make you feel alone. Drinking alone, one of the worst mental states you could be in unless you're really good at it.
That's a rough spot to be in.
Yep, and I don't think there's any data medically, psychologically, biologically, or otherwise which would ever say that is a healthy outcome. It's just an outcome, unfortunately. And knowing that, as I mentioned, son of a Marine, my dad, I've never seen drunk or drink when he was alive because he had done all of that in a short amount of time after Vietnam, and as a result was no longer able to afford drinking at all due to biological reasons, short liver shit with that. And so it's kind of interesting that management strategy for a little bit, but again, you can't sustain that. Something's going to break. My ex-neighbor, unfortunately, well-known issues with alcohol. I don't believe or know if that had anything to do with his final passing, but it always wears on you in some way. And I'm sure that as he saw me sneak back to the shed, smoking a bunch of fucking lefties when I was a teen, I would have fucking been enamored if somehow it's like cop knock at the door and it's like, can I get one of those? Be like, weirdest day of life ever. But appreciated. Good day, although weird. So that's a lot of the good side. So on the other side, why should cops not be allowed to use marijuana? Well, I'll kick off. Because some of us out there might just be bitter enough to think they've caused so much damage that they shouldn't be able to enjoy these laws. So screw them. And I understand. I think the opportunity of thought's there for everybody. Hopefully we can be a little bit more mature than we have been treated overall. I'm not saying turn your cheek like Jesus, like a rotating door. But I don't believe I'm bitter enough to not think other humans could benefit. I mean, I want cannabis access with responsibility, but generally ubiquitously across the board. But guns seem to be the big thing.
Yeah, I think that's the big issue. I think the only really coming into this call, kind of knowing that this was going to be a topic, I really had no answer for this part of the question of, why wouldn't they be able to? And it wasn't until you read that question about, well, what are you going to do if somebody has it in their bloodstream and something bad happens? That I think would be the only argument that I would have, which is a pretty fragile one at best, is really just CYA. Is really all that one is just cover your ass and hope for the best. I don't really think there's much of an argument against it because they will always find something to lean on.
Yeah.
And
I mean, how they go through what they say, it's the divorce, they were tired, like, generally whenever cops shoot off their gun or do some misbehavior, they seem to blame everything. So this would absolutely put weed more in the target where they'd be like, well, you know, some kid in the 30s who was Mexican went psychotic on that marijuana with an H. And so it must have been the officer of the law. You know, almost concurrently as I was researching this, my sister, who from previous episodes I mentioned, brilliant woman, not really aligned with cannabis, more maligned. And so she sends me, like, I wouldn't say passive aggressive because I enjoy them too much, but another set of 6 articles. And one was from 2014 about a cannibalism case in Florida, which was thought to be bath salts.
I read this.
He was only high on weed, but they still didn't say the weed made him a cannibal. They just said, you know, weed was in his system because it lasted a long time.
Just gave him the munchies is all.
He just had to eat some face, like 75% of some homeless dude's face, apparently.
Yeah.
They also had one, and this is the one I'm sure that cops would have to fight, concerns regarding cannabis and psychosis leading to violence. And I read this fucker, and I just like cracking up because I know, you know, as I said, it's kind of like trolling me, which I enjoy. But even at one part of this, I found a fat paragraph that said, none of these studies prove that rising cannabis use has caused population-wide increases in psychosis or other mental illnesses, although they do offer suggestive evidence of a link. And so it was like, okay, so you're pretty much just saying there's no, here we go, the link between marijuana and violence doesn't appear limited to people with pre-existing psychosis. And it's like, there is no link. People really do like to create suggestions, as you said. Obviously, there's no pattern. So I love reading these things because they do tell you just, oh, we're so close, except they're still just lies. And it's not to say, again, there's somebody out there who uses cannabis and is not helping them out. We're not saying it's
for sure.
positive all the time. We just know that generally, as you said, the munchies don't apply to cannibalism. You know, I was killing it in Halo yesterday. The last season just came out. If you love some Halo Infinite, by all means, DM me up, let me know what your rank is, and know that there are no ranks. But I was killing it, but I didn't feel like going outside and like shooting up the place, you know, wiping out hats at McDonald's just because I like to play with a battle rifle in Halo. If anything, it prevents me from doing that.
Well, that's the same argument that's been around for a long time, as well as, you know, violent video games and all that stuff. And there's been 0 studies with that show any correlation. Well, reputable studies.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of people, I can see patterns. Blue is blue, but that doesn't mean the ocean is the sky, right? Like we have to hopefully add details to it as well. So, we've come through quite a bit of this. And I think that in seeing why they should be allowed versus shouldn't, the only other reasons I have on my list of potential reasons they shouldn't, guns as the big one, because they might be fired for it, but that's more situational, right? That's not righteous. That's just because it's likely to happen. And, you know, potentially because you're bitter and you just, much like the school loans people out there, right? The whole idea is if you weren't able to get your school loans paid by the government, then I'm full of hate. You know, why should I let other people benefit from it? And it's like, I'm sorry, this is silly logic, but I understand. Sometimes the timing's off for you. So, in thought of one last detail to add to it, was a talk to one of the officers in that vault as they surrounded and we were getting to talk about cannabis for one of the best conversations I personally had because it was so unique. It was obvious there's a lot of complexity to this because one of the gents who was a little younger, the other guy was close to retirement, so he was kind of like, oh, I can't wait for the day. But the other gent was like, well, here's one thing you folks have to realize, you know, being very happy, slightly high in a vault. He's like, I only know this job. So if I lose this job, I don't have anything to fall back on. No trades, no education. I became a cop straight out of high school. And so there's a fear, a lot of officers might have this other fear that we all have potentially depending on where we are in our career fields, besides the pain and stress from work and all the physio-mental health issues. Some of them have an anti-cannabis attitude, but some of it's just getting afraid that you can lose your job in almost every single way you act except for one. And so some of the hard line or hard assedness is because it's like, well, if I project this, I keep employed. Now, I always say politicians are the most afraid to lose their jobs more than anybody, right? They will do anything to get voted back in.
Yeah.
But cops are going to be a close second potentially in the fact that because anything you say about an officer could make their job be more difficult, have them lose it. Again, I'm not saying for the sake that, you know, I don't want their jobs to be harder, certainly, if it's that hard, because there are mortal areas to it. Fuck with politicians, that is your job. I'm going to come at you every day. You know, it's a little cushy in the way I think it is. But that's one big one big thing that's never wavered is responsible behavior 24/7 for officers, right? They have to have a gun on them at all times. So it becomes very, very hard to talk about a time they can get high enough where they're not expected to act like an officer. I think, and it sounds like you think as well, maybe some of the folks out there in the metaverse think it too, that maybe letting them actually get a break from the job might actually make them able to do it better. Who the fuck can be in their job 24/7 without going insane?
Right. It's like, I feel like you and I both have fairly demanding jobs, but they're in a field that we enjoy. But if somebody asked me to do my job for 24 hours a day, every day, I would no longer do this job or want to do it, or I would have a very jaded opinion of it. I think that's a super interesting point that, they are asked to be on alert, looking after their community at all times. Like, if you're a fireman, you are maybe on for 10 straight days, but then you have a time where they cannot contact you. You may be on call, but there's a time where you cannot be reached. And I think that's a really good point, is that if you open it up to give them time to, take real vacation, take a staycation, stay at home and just get baked for 10 days. Like, I feel like that's a really interesting point that, if you give them that opportunity, I'm sure they would take it. And I feel like that would alleviate a lot of stress buildup. There's no real outlet for them to put it anywhere.
Yeah. And if it was a thing where you're like, hey, you got 2 days off, 3 days off a week. I know a lot of officers do like medical where it's 12 on, 12 off kind of thing. And like that isn't already stressful. And then you have all the other things you depend on. Why do you think so many cops are tired when they defend themselves against misbehavior? They're not lying about that part, certainly, and I would trust
Right.
that it is a very tiring job. It's good to see attitudes are shifting, obviously, depending on which state you're in, not a whole lot of them. But it seems it's more red tape right now than personal attitudes of the officers. Much like we mentioned before, old folks run things still, especially when you go in institutions like medicine, education, politics, law enforcement. These are some of the oldest industries, some of the most dominated by tradition, and you do have to wait for things to die. Not preference, but it is what it is. And overall, once you consider some of these hurdles, I mean, I know that even for me, when I'm limping that badly, some days I can watch like a Jackie Chan film and it's like, oh man, one day maybe I'll get back on my feet. But some days you watch it and you're like, fuck that dude for backflipping the whole way down the street. I can't even walk up a stairwell. And that is something you have to understand. Some folks, if they don't get access, if they can see everybody else is smoking J's enjoying themselves, a couple days you might want to join them. Then a couple days you're like, nah, screw you even double. Why? Because now I have to not only say no, but I have to like be the one to cut it out from your behavior when it's bad. And that really does twist the mind into an even worse and healthy state. So all in all, I think we've tackled it as much as we can before we need to get a cop on the show, which is a perfect impetus. Anybody out there who's willing to jump into the, I don't know if you call us lions, but the den of green, to the U.S. Chamber, the cannabis professor, by all means, DM me on Instagram. I will not blow you up, even if you just have a good quote. Anonymously so. I prefer a primary source. I don't want to speak for anybody. Everybody's their own individual for it. But I would look forward to that. Fingers crossed on that potential in the future, because I know I can find some ex-military. But, cops have a much different job to do since it's domestic as well. And it's just interesting to hear a couple hot takes. You can probably remain anonymous when you jump on the show. But feel free to contact me or Sir Keegan if you know him. We would love to absorb you in that. And what would you say, Keegan? I think that's all we have for them today, right?
Yeah, I think that's great. I think that was a really interesting, full body topic. I like that.
Yeah, there's a lot to consider with it. And as we said, for the third time over, it's not to make it easier to understand police just because, again, if they did something poorly to you, if an individual did, your experience takes absolute suit. But to understand the problem, you can't think of it as one officer or one district or one township. It is national. And you have to think of every situation where it could be used against them. It's a complex thing, I wouldn't say it's easy for the folks who have to deal with it, but I would say if you err on the side of weed, I don't know if you're making a situation worse, although it is going to get more complicated. But at least for us here at the Cannabis Professor, the U.S. Chamber of Cannabis, check out the YouTube, which went up recently. 2 videos up, third one. After I get a little bit of sleep, I swear we'll go up there. Check out Chill Frog CBD if you need a great CBD manufacturer, full spectrum CBD. I use the sleep ones for some sleep and use code Professor30 at checkout to save a little bit. We're on Instagram, of course, at the cannabis.professor, or actually no longer dot. I took the dot out.
Nice.
Just
no dots.
Professor. And I joined TikTok, but I haven't put shit up there yet. So yeah, I'm old. I was learned slow.
We'll get there. We'll get it. We'll be pumping it out.
We'll strategize. We got some good stuff planned. Might be going to the Gettysburg Cannafest next weekend.
Yeah, come find us.
Time's on our side. You'll see potentially me out there with a white coat and a microphone, and come say hello. Might ask you a random question about weed. Might be a cool little weed on the street kind of thing we want to do. Keegan is here really because we have so much going on, and I need the help, and he is a man overqualified to help. Website coming up soon. Patreon soon. Thank you, everybody, for listening to me and the Keegs as we gassed a little bit about what it is to think about with the weed police and exactly how they'll be. Until next time, my friends, from the professor and the man called Keegan, be sure to grow knowledge and extract truth, because we are out.